If you are just joining us today, once again, we gather around the table. As I told before, most of, or all of the principles in my life, all of the foundation of who I was as a person in my life, and my ethical and moral compass, if you will, was formulated around the dinner table each night. My family would gather at 5:15 on the dot when my dad got home from work, and the meal was there, and we would share and talk and fuss, cuss, discuss, and we learned about tension. And today, as we gather around the table, I can remember one thing that was always clear in my family from a very young age. I remember growing up, we were encouraged to invite others, our friends, to join us around our table. It wasn't just for the family. And there had been countless, as we look back, or as I look back through pictures, family pictures, there have been countless numbers of boyfriends my sisters had, and girlfriends my brother had, and Kelly's here, so I won't say nobody came with me, but my friends or girlfriends or whatever, all the people that joined around our table. And it was even neat that even after I left the Memphis area, or I was playing with the band, or was gone, or couldn't make it around the table, there were some of my friends, and I've talked about two of them, David and Mark. They were welcome around the table also, even if I wasn't there. So it was kind of neat around the table. And I can remember in college, late at night, we would sit in a gathering area with all my friends, and we would begin to talk about life. And whenever you have two or more people gathered, there may be an occasion when someone will say something controversial, someone will say something they're not supposed to say, someone will let a secret out, and something that immediately causes tension around the table. And it's in that moment their air seems to be about 10 feet thick. And so the question for us this morning is, what do we do when we do not see eye to eye with someone? I mean, what do we do in our friendships or with our relationships with our family members? What do we do when everyone does not agree? And we return to the table with Paul this morning as he is discussing this idea. If you didn't see the message last week, please see it. It's online and everywhere, because I think God has something to say about that. But he's discussing this idea about Jesus. And is the grace of Jesus enough for salvation? And Paul has said, yes, it is enough. It is the grace of Jesus alone, and not Jesus plus circumcision. It's not Jesus plus these rules. It's not Jesus plus this church thing. It's not Jesus plus these traditions that we've done every year. But it's the grace of God and God alone that causes salvation. And then the first part of Galatians in chapter 2, in this letter that Paul is writing to the church in Galatia, he is saying this. And he basically says, I want you to, if you will, go back and read the first 8 verses of chapter 2 by yourself. But basically, for the sake of time, he's saying that grace is alone. And he said, 14 years ago, I got to know the pillars of our movement, Peter, James, and John. 14 years ago, these three men invited me in to help with this movement of Jesus Christ. And together, all four of us around the table came up with the ministry plan. Came up with how I would preach the gospel of Jesus Christ and take this message of Christ and grace to a group of Gentiles, which means non-Jews. And the three of y'all would take it to the Jews. I mean, we came up with this plan. And so he's telling them how he's been preaching and teaching the gospel of Jesus to the Gentiles, and how he's been teaching all of them about grace, and then they began to have a fit. And it's where we find Paul gives us these four principles, if you will, or four pieces of advice of how we deal with friends or family members when there is tension. Because believe me, there is tension around this table. We begin with verse 8. As they're sitting around and there's this tension, Paul says, "For God who was at work in circumcised, the same God was also at work in me as an apostle to the Gentiles. James, Peter, and John, those esteemed as pillars of the faith in this thing, gave me and Barnabas the right hand of fellowship when they recognized the grace given to me. They welcomed me and they asked me to join this thing. They agreed that we would go to the Gentiles and that they would go to the circumcised or the non-Gentiles. All they asked was that we would continue to remember the poor. The very thing I have been eager to do all along. The first thing, if you want to write down in your sermon notes or take with you, Paul says there is unity in the essentials and flexibility and grace in the non-essentials. Now the Jewish leaders were saying, yes, they were saying, yes, it is the grace of God, but it's the grace of Jesus plus circumcision. Hey, look, they're saying, hey, look, we're all circumcised. Okay? So we believe that the non-Jews, in order to be good Christians, they ought to be circumcised too. Now, it's important to note that Paul was a great Jew. He was circumcised. And Paul acknowledges that when we have tension with our friends around issues or the table, that we need to be unified in the essentials and flexible and gracious in the non-essentials. Paul recognizes the difference between who God has called him to serve and who God's called Peter to serve, and James and John. And the grace of Jesus was essential to both groups. Paul says God did great works through you, Peter, James and John. And God did great works through me. Verse 9. He says, remember there was two groups. He says, look, you guys, welcome to the beginning. You guys called me. You guys asked me and Barnabas into this movement, knowing all well from the beginning the plan we had. We agreed from the beginning. I take the Gentiles, you three the Jews. We said we would both place the poor, those that could not take care of themselves. We all agreed that that would be essential. That would be the focus of our work and the focus of who we are. Whatever we did, whoever we ministered to, the poor, those who could not take care of themselves, would be essential to everything we did. We all agreed, remember? And Paul said, I'm doing what you agreed to do all along from the beginning. I'm doing what you called me to do as a minister. Do we minister to the same people? Paul says, no, we don't. Do we minister the same way? No, we don't. But he said, no matter what, we all agreed that the core would be to help the poor. That is essential. Everything else can be flexible. We'll show grace and understanding on everything else. As the one that you called to be the leader of this faith community, one of the moments I arrived, I realized, in conversations with Kelly and myself, I realized that we were a divided faith community. When I realized our worship was not a time that we came together, one of the things that God burned in my soul was it had to change. Something had to transform. And I got a flack, and I'm still getting a lot of flack. But when we came up with a new worship, we said, okay, let's keep unity as our essential. I mean, isn't worship about being unified and worshiping God together? Can't we be unified in our love for God and one another and be flexible and gracious in the 9 essentials? I mean, such as what time do we worship? Non-essentials like what songs do we sing? I mean, non-essentials like music. I mean, why would anyone want me to preach to one group at one time and another group at another hour? And see, I again, last week I said there's some things that are simply said and seem simple to the mind but are hard to do. We need to be willing to put the friend before the friendship. We need to be willing to put the friend before the friendship. When things got tense around the table, Paul's eyes were watching Peter. No one else. As this tension arose, Paul's eyes was fixed on Peter because he knew Peter, when Peter came to visit him, he knew and he saw a huge inconsistency in Peter's character. Join with me in as we move to chapter 11. He says, when Peter came to Antioch, I opposed him to his face because he stood condemned. For before certain men came from James, he used to eat with the Gentiles. But when they arrived, he began to draw back and separate himself from the Gentiles because he was afraid of those who belonged to the circumcision group. The other Jews joined in his hypocrisy, so that by their hypocrisy, even Barnabas was led astray. And when I saw that they were not acting in line with the truth of the gospel of Jesus Christ, I said to Peter in front of everyone, you are a Jew, yet you live like a Gentile and not like a Jew. How is it that, then, that you force Gentiles to follow your Jewish customs? We who are Jews by birth and not sinful Gentiles know a person is not justified by the works of the law, but by the faith in Jesus Christ. So we too have to put our faith in Jesus Christ, that we may be justified by faith in Christ and not by the works of the law, because the works of the law, no one will be justified. I think basically in minor terms, what Paul does is he calls Peter out. He says, man, what are you doing? Look, you ate with the Gentiles. You didn't follow the Jewish customs of cleanliness and the laws about eating. You were among us. You did not mention this circumcision thing, but the minute you heard James's guys were coming, you distanced yourself from us. The minute you heard James's buddies were coming, the Jews, you were scared that they would go back and rat you out. You pulled away. I mean, this sounds like something that happens in junior high school, but it's happening around the table in our Holy Scriptures. So in front of everyone, Paul looks in Peter's eyes and says, look, I love you. I care about you. But I cannot let you act this way. You cannot act one way and then force us to follow your Jewish customs. And then when you don't, do it when James and his buddies aren't around. You can't do that. Paul was willing to put the friend before the friendship. It's saying, hey, look, I love you, but you're drinking too much. Hey, look, I love you, but it seems like in this conversation, you're going way over here. Look, I love you enough, but what you're doing is you're saying lies and gossip and false witness to people. I love you enough to say stop. And I'm willing to risk the friendship, to put you first. Your character, your leadership. You see, Paul was willing to risk all that. Paul wasn't doing this to be right. Paul wasn't doing this to be holier and thou in front of his friends and everybody else. He was doing this because he loved his friend. He cared for his friend. He loved him enough to notice the inconsistency in his character. He said, look, I care about you. But what you are doing, the way you are acting, are putting our relationship at stake. You're putting the respect that everyone else around here has you at stake. And you're putting your leadership at stake. I've got to help you. You cannot ride two sides of the fence here. And I pray in my prayer that if someone in your inner circle, someone that cares and loves about you, I pray that if your life gets in a certain situation, that they would do the same for you. I pray that you would be willing to step in and place the friend before the friendship. And that you have the courage and strength to overcome the potential Peter eventually repents. Peter eventually sees himself and sees what he's doing and becomes very, very apologetic. Very, very aware of what his actions were doing. The third thing, as we read, Paul says, do not compromise on your convictions. You see, for Paul, this Jesus plus circumcision or plus anything else, for Paul, it was a deal breaker. This was a deal breaker for Paul. Because as I said last week, Paul's entire life has been about the grace of Jesus and Jesus alone. Paul's entire message for 14 years that he had been preaching and that he was willing to die for, that he gave everything of himself for. His entire teaching, his entire life had been built around the fact that it is grace and grace of Jesus alone that we are saved. And the reason Paul is even writing this letter in the first place is because people were spreading lies and gossip about him and telling the churches in Galatia, you know what? Paul is for this plus thing too. They had been going and working their way into the churches throughout Galatia and saying, you know what? No, Paul wants you to be circumcised too. Paul says it's the grace of God plus something else, plus something that. And the churches are asking and sending word to Paul and saying, tell us, Paul, come on, we followed you, we trusted you, tell us, is it Jesus alone or is it Jesus plus something else enough for salvation? It's pretty important for us to know. And see, Paul was not willing for 1 second to compromise his convictions. It's relevant to our daily lives as well. You see, around the table, we might not be debating with our friends or our loved ones that it's Jesus plus traditions of the church, or Jesus plus this, or Jesus plus leadership. We may not be debating that around the table. But what we may be debating, and what's being debated here, is really, what is our integrity worth? That's what it means. What is our integrity worth? For every single one of us, our integrity has a price. And when we forfeit our convictions, we sell out our integrity. And Paul is saying around this table, I am not willing to do that no matter what the cost. I am not willing to sell out. I'm not willing, if you run me out of here, I'm not willing, if none of the churches in Galatians follow me, I am not willing to say that it's Jesus' grace plus something. Last but not least, this is why Paul says this. Our fourth principle that we can learn from when there's tension around the table or tension in relationships is be confident in knowing where everything came from. Be confident in knowing where everything came from. You see, Paul was confident. Not cocky, not arrogant. He was confident. He could handle the tension around the table because he knew where everything came from. He knew that all he was. He knew that all he had done. Paul knew that all he would ever do in the name of Jesus Christ. Paul knew everything he was and was to be, and everything he said was because of the grace of Jesus Christ. That alone. Verse 20. It says, verse 20. I have been crucified with Christ, and I no longer live, but it's Christ who lives in me. The life I now live in the body I live by faith in the Son of God, who loved me and gave himself for me. How could Paul have the presence of mind to stand his ground? How could Paul stand strong and to say, when there's a tension around the table, let's be unified in our essentials and flexible and gracious in our non-essentials? How can Paul say we need to be willing to put the friend before the friendship? How can Paul say do not compromise compromise your own conviction? How could Paul be confident in everything he did and said? How could Paul, when it became tense around the table, how could he handle the conflict and confrontation? Paul could handle it because he knew it was the grace of God that permitted him to be and to do all that he has done in his life. And what is true for Paul is true for every single one of us. Let us pray.